Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romance for a restful night. If these stories help you unwind, be sure to subscribe. For now, close your eyes and let's begin tonight's story. The Last Hug Before Winter. The snow came to Savannah like an apology. It fell tentatively, the way polite things do, uncertain of its welcome this far south, settling on the moss-draped oaks and the cobblestones with the delicacy of a held breath. Clara Bell Tucker stood on the station platform and watched it disappear against the warm brick of the depot wall, each flake extinguished the moment it found solid ground. She'd been awake since 4 a.m. She knew this because she had watched the clock on the kitchen wall through every hour, her coffee going cold in her hands, unable to explain to herself why she kept making more. Some part of her body had decided that remaining useful was the only alternative to falling apart. Thomas stood beside his kit bag 6 feet away, talking with another soldier from Milledgeville, whose name Clara could not remember no matter how many times she'd been told it. She watched the side of Thomas's face, the way his jaw moved when he laughed at something she could not hear above the crowd, the way he reached up to adjust his collar and then caught himself, leaving his hand at his throat for a moment as though surprised to find it there. She had married him 8 months ago in a ceremony that lasted 23 minutes. Her father had given a toast that consisted mostly of advice about savings accounts. Helen Dice had cried, and then pretended she hadn't, blowing her nose into a handkerchief and looking away toward the courthouse windows. Thomas had held Clara's hand so tightly through the whole of it that she had felt the separate bones of her own fingers for the first time, as though he were teaching her the architecture of herself. He was not handsome in the way magazines were handsome. His nose had been broken once, reknit slightly off-centre. His hands were a mechanic's hands, knuckled and capable, the creases dark with grease that never fully washed out. But when he turned those hands towards something delicate, when he cupped a moth he'd found against a window pane, or held her chin to examine a cut above her eye where she'd knocked herself on the kitchen cabinet, they became the most careful instruments she had ever witnessed. He had loved her, she'd come to understand, before she'd understood what it meant to be loved. He had noticed her nervous habit of pressing her thumbnail into her palm when she was frightened, and he had never named it, only quietly taken her hand in those moments until the habit had no room to operate. He had noticed she preferred the window seat on any bus or train, had noted without comment that she took her coffee black in cold weather and with cream in warm, had twice arrived at her door carrying library books she had mentioned only in passing weeks before. These were not grand gestures. He did not compose poems. He never said, "She smiled at this even now, even standing on this platform with her heart already beginning to break. I would cross the ends of the earth for you." He was too honest for that sort of language. What he said in their ordinary evenings was closer to, "You're cold, come here," or "Tell me that part again," or simply waking at 3 a.m. and finding her staring at the ceiling. What is it? 2 words, in the dark, with complete attention. That was Thomas. That was what would be taken from her. He excused himself from the soldier and came to her now, and she straightened immediately, her back a schoolteacher's back, composed, correct, because she was determined not to be the woman who collapsed on the platform. There were enough of those. She'd witnessed 2 mothers and a young bride already, and she had told herself with some private cruelty, "Not you. You will hold." He stood before her. His coat was army wool, rough and dark, already carrying the smell of institutional soap rather than himself. She hated that smell. "You're cold," he said. "I'm not." "Clara." "I'm perfectly." He simply reached out and took both her hands inside both of his, and the argument ended. They stood like that while the platform churned around them. A conductor announced a delay on the northbound line. A child lost a glove and began screaming about it with the full moral outrage available to 5-year-olds. Steam plumed from the engine in white columns that dissolved into the low winter sky. Somewhere behind them a woman was saying, I know the way you say something that helps nobody. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had made this promise at 4 a.m. while watching the kitchen clock, and again while pinning her hair, and again on the walk to the station when the cold came off the river and she'd had to stop and breathe through it. She had made the promise the way women of her particular generation and particular stubbornness made promises, quietly, privately, with complete intention and no audience. She was already losing it. I have something to tell you, Thomas said. Don't. Clara, if it begins with if I don't come back, she said, I am going to remove my hands from your coat and walk to the other end of this platform, and you will board that train watching my back. His mouth pressed together, not quite a smile, something more complicated than a smile. The expression she had come to know as Thomas holding two feelings simultaneously, and not having decided yet which one to let through. It doesn't begin that way, he said. She waited. Close your eyes. She looked at him instead. A refusal. A small, stubborn act of holding on. Clara. His voice was low, steady. The voice he used when something mattered past the point of argument. Close your eyes. She closed them. And the world became something different. The platform fell away. The noise of it. The press of all those other people gripping all those other goodbyes. And what replaced it was sensation, pure and specific. The crowd became sound instead of sight. Steam. The distant bell of the depot clock. Snow, so tentative this far south, so light she could hear it settling against the wool of her coat like breath, like something alive and deliberate landing softly on her shoulders. She waited for him to speak. Instead, his warmth arrived. Always his warmth first. She had noticed this in the early months of knowing him, that specific excess of heat he carried, as though life ran more intensely in him than in other people, as though the ordinary temperature of the world was insufficient for whatever Thomas Tucker was doing inside it. The warmth reached her before his arms did, before his hands. Before any part of him made contact with any part of her, she felt him, felt the fact of him, the living reality of him, 3 feet away on a train platform in December 1942. Then his arms came around her, not gently. She registered this immediately, the absence of gentleness, the way this was its opposite. This was the full, unguarded, almost desperate certainty of a man who had decided he was finished being careful with the thing he needed most. His arms came around her completely without apology, and his hand, wide and warm and calloused at the palm, pressed against the back of her head, and her cheek found his chest, and through 3 layers of wool and the buttons of his uniform and all the distance that was already beginning to open between them, she found it. His heartbeat, steady, unhurried, real. She almost laughed. The force of it had startled her, the sheer physical fact of being held that completely. And the laugh rose involuntarily, the nervous response of a body caught off guard. But before it could surface, she felt it. He was trembling. She went still, not from cold. The trembling had nothing to do with the 20-degree air coming sharp off the river. Thomas trembled the way a structure trembles, not at the surface, not from anything as simple as weather, but from somewhere foundational, somewhere load-bearing. The deep interior shudder of something that has been holding enormous weight for a long time, and is only now, in private, allowing itself to feel it. She tightened her arms around him. She felt the trembling move through her own body, the way sound moves through water. Not heard, not seen, simply conducted. Bone to bone, chest to chest. He's terrified, she thought. And then, with the particular clarity that comes from knowing a person all the way down, not of dying. Thomas was not afraid of the bullet or the artillery shell or whatever waited across an ocean. to fulfill its statistical probability against his body. She understood this suddenly and completely. He was afraid of something quieter, more specific, more devastating. He was afraid of the space he would leave, of becoming absence in the life of the person he loved most, of being reduced, slowly, by the ordinary mercy of time, to a photograph, a letter, a name spoken, with diminishing frequency, of being forgotten even from her grief. He was afraid that the feeling of him would eventually leave her. "Don't," she thought, "don't you dare." "Now," he said. His voice was rough, close to her ear. "I want you to do something, and I need you to trust me." She said nothing. She was listening to his heartbeat against her cheek. "Imagine I'm gone." Her breath stopped. "Stay with me. Don't pull away from it. Imagine tomorrow there is no letter, no word, nothing coming back across that ocean." His arms tightened slightly, as though he could feel her instinct to retreat from the image. "Imagine this. Right now, what you're feeling right now, is the last time. That after I step back, there is only the life you'll live without me in it." She didn't want to. Every instinct she possessed rose up against it. The superstition of it, the cruelty of conjuring that particular darkness on a train platform with his train already breathing behind him, and the conductor already moving down the line. She did not want to imagine it. She'd been not imagining it for weeks with a fierce and exhausting determination. But she trusted him. She had always trusted him in the way you trust a person who has never once been careless with your interior life. So she let herself go there. She imagined the telegram. She had seen them delivered to other women on other streets, and she knew the grammar of that moment. The government car, the knock, the words that rearranged the entire architecture of a future in under a minute. She imagined the specific silence that would follow. Not the silence of a man in another room or a man at work or a man coming home later, but the permanent silence, the kind that does not end. The side of the bed that would stay cold, the coffee she would keep making too much of, the winter evenings with the radio on and no one to share them with, his chair across from hers empty, evening after evening after evening, the particular quality of a house from which the right person has been permanently removed. She imagined all of it while his heartbeat pressed against her cheek, while his arms held her, still, warm, real, while his trembling moved through her like sound through water. She held the loss and the present simultaneously, felt both at once, the grief of what might be taken and the overwhelming, unbearable, breathtaking fact of what was still here. And the collision of those two things produced something she had no word for, something that was grief and gratitude fused into a single feeling, indistinguishable, both of them the same love operating in two directions at once. She was crying. She made no attempt to stop, let the platform observe, let all of Savannah witness Clara Tucker crying into her husband's coat on a December morning. She'd been holding herself at careful distance from this feeling for weeks, and she was done being careful. She pressed her face into the rough wool of his uniform, and she wept with the honesty of someone who has finally stopped pretending that loss is something that happens to other people. She felt his lips against her forehead. Not a quick kiss, not a farewell peck, the kind exchanged at doors, a long, deliberate, unhurried pressure, as though he were making an impression, as though he were saying, "Remember the exact weight of this. Remember precisely this." She felt it in her bones. "Good," he whispered. A pause. The clock. The steam. The snow. "Now open your eyes." She did. He was still there. He had pulled back just enough to see her face, and he was looking at her. Not at her tears, not at the platform behind her, not at the train. At her. With the complete and undistracted attention she'd come to understand was the rarest thing one person could offer another. His own eyes were wet but steady. That particular steadiness he possessed, that quality of holding himself perfectly still when the thing in front of him mattered enormously, as though stillness were a form of respect. She looked back at him. She looked at him the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in weeks, not through the comfortable gauze of there will be more time, there will be other mornings, there will be years of ordinary evenings ahead of us. She looked at him without that protection, clearly, completely. She looked at the off-centre nose and the mechanic's hands and the uniform that smelled like institutional soap instead of him, and she looked at his face, and she let herself feel, fully, without defence, the absolute specific, irreplaceable weight of this person, this man, who removed his gloves in cold weather before taking her hands because he wanted her to feel skin, who had memorised how she took her coffee in different seasons, who noticed when she was frightened before she said a word, who was still here, right now, still here. "I need you to remember this," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Not my face, not what I look like. This, what you're feeling right now, this weight in your chest, this." He pressed her hand once against his heart. "Take this feeling with you. Every ordinary day you have, every morning you think there's nothing particular to be grateful for. I need you to remember what it felt like to stand here and imagine I was gone." She understood. Not a comfort, not a farewell. Something more demanding and more lasting than either. He was giving her a practice, a way of loving that required courage, the courage to hold the fragility of someone alongside the fact of them, to stand at the edge of losing a person and look down, fully, without flinching, and then turn back to find them still there and feel that as the miracle it actually was. To refuse the ordinary human habit of moving through the days of a life beside the people you love most, as though those days are guaranteed, as though presence is the default, as though there will always be another morning. There would not always be another morning. There was only ever this morning, only this platform, this cold, this snow, this heartbeat beneath her palm. She pressed her hand harder against his chest. "I feel it," she thought. "I feel it, I feel it, I feel it." "Remember, I'm still here," he said. "Right now, Clara, I'm still here." She looked at him, at the man who was still alive, still warm, still breathing, his heart still legible beneath her hand, and for one extraordinary moment she saw him the way you see something you're about to lose and have decided, at the last possible moment, to truly receive, not take for granted, not assume, not save for later, receive, right now, in this moment, completely. The conductor called the line. Thomas stepped back, picked up his kit bag, looked at her one final time with an expression she would spend 70 years attempting to accurately reconstruct and never quite managing, because some things, she would come to understand, are not stored in memory. They are stored in the body, in the specific pressure of a hand against a heartbeat, in the warmth of someone who runs a degree or two above the ordinary world, in the feeling, fierce and terrifying and luminous, of understanding for one unguarded moment that the person in front of you is not permanent, that they are here now, that now is the only time love is ever actually available, that now is everything. She watched him walk toward the train. She did not look away. Not once. Not until the steam took him. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in December, on a day when the rain was coming down in the flat, relentless way that makes Savannah look like a painting left out in the weather. Clara saw the government car from her kitchen window. She was washing a single cup. Her cup. There had only ever been one cup to wash these days. And she stood at the window watching the car park, and something in her simply understood. The body knows before the mind does. She set the cup down with extraordinary care. She dried her hands on her apron. She removed the apron and folded it over the back of the kitchen chair, because she did not want to be wearing an apron when she answered the door. The officer was young, younger than Thomas had been. He had the face of someone who had delivered this news before and had not yet made his peace with it, and she was obscurely grateful to him for that, for not having organised his expression into professional sympathy. Thomas Casey Tucker, killed in action, Northern France, December 19th, 1944. She thanked him. She closed the door. She walked to the kitchen and stood at the window and watched the car pull away. There was no body. This was what broke her, though she could not have explained why it mattered so precisely. The absence of a grave, a marker, a fixed point in the physical world where loss had been made official. Thomas existed now only as an administrative determination, a word on government paper, killed, as though killing was something that happened simply, cleanly, once. People came. Her neighbour brought a ham. Helen Dice arrived within 40 minutes and sat with Clara for 3 days without once suggesting that she should eat or sleep or feel anything differently than she felt, which was the only mercy Clara could have accepted. The churchwomen sent flowers. Her father telephoned and said, in his particular way of loving through practicality, "You're young yet, Clara Bell," as though youth were a consolation, as though youth were not precisely the wound. She did not collapse. She had promised herself she wouldn't, there on the platform, and she kept that promise with an effort that cost her something she never fully recovered. She returned to school in January. She corrected spelling tests. She ate supper. She replied to letters. She was, and this was the word everyone used, she heard it endlessly in the months that followed, so strong. She was not strong. She was suspended. There is a difference. In her bedroom, she began sleeping on only her side of the bed. This was not conscious. She simply woke one morning and understood that her body had arranged itself in the night to preserve the other half, the Thomas half, as though cellular memory were more faithful than grief could manage on its own. She did not correct it. In the kitchen drawer beside the silver she kept his final letter. It was 3 paragraphs long, the third of which was entirely about the weather in France. The second paragraph ended, "Been thinking about your hands lately." She read this line every winter for the rest of her life without ever quite exhausting what it meant to her. The years continued in the way that years do, with complete indifference to whether you were ready. Clara taught 4th grade through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson and Nixon. She planted roses in spring and failed to keep them through August heat. She raised her younger sister Margaret after their parents died, and Margaret grew up and married a man from Macon, who drove a truck and loved her straightforwardly and well, and Clara felt about this a happiness so pure it surprised her. She laughed sometimes. She attended church picnics. She aged with a certain controlled elegance, the kind that comes from deciding not to let yourself fall to pieces publicly. But every winter, when the first cold came down from the north, and the oak trees went bare, and the savannah air carried that particular sharpness, cold river, dead leaves, the distant suggestion of snow, she would feel it, an interior stillness, a quality of listening for something that would not come. Helen remained. Helen, who had never married. She claimed she had simply never found someone worth the inconvenience, and delivered this pronouncement with such self-satisfied authority that Clara believed her for 20 years before she understood it wasn't entirely true. Helen, who met Clara for coffee every Saturday for 6 decades, who understood without being told when not to talk, who said once, during a rainstorm in 1962, the only thing anyone ever said to Clara about Thomas that helped, "Grief is not a sickness, Clara. It's a country. Some people simply live there longer than others." In the winter of 1947, Thomas Casey Tucker stood on the sidewalk across from a house on Abercorn Street in Savannah and watched another family's children play in what had been Clara's yard. He had been standing there for 11 minutes. He had counted. He had come home in August, or something had come home that wore his body. The POW camps had taught him that survival and living are not synonymous, a distinction that sounded philosophical when written and felt like a slow hemorrhage when lived. His hands still worked, his legs still functioned with only a slight favouring of the left. The head wound had healed enough, the army doctors said, though there were gaps in his memory like rooms in a house with the doors taken off the hinges. He could see into them but couldn't quite enter. He remembered Clara's face precisely. He remembered the platform, the snow, her arms around him, the way she had cried against his chest with a kind of honesty he had never witnessed from her before or since. He remembered her saying nothing, which was better than anything she could have said. He had written. The letters had returned. He had telephoned the number he remembered and a stranger had answered. He had gone to her father's address and found the house sold. She had moved, someone on the block told him, after the telegram. Gone to live with her sister, they thought. Somewhere. The rational response was to continue searching. Thomas looked at the children in the yard, a boy and a girl chasing each other around the porch with a purposeless joy, available only to people who have no idea what a station platform in December can cost a person. He thought of Clara. He thought of what he'd come home as versus what he'd gone away as. He thought of the specific quality of his own shame, not dramatic shame, not the guilt of a man who had done something wrong, but the quieter devastation of a man who had returned damage to someone he had no right to damage further. She had survived, he told himself. She had moved. She had rebuilt. She deserved to finish building without him arriving at her door like a ruins, like an archaeological site of a man. This was the logic of emotional cowardice dressed in the clothing of mercy, and he knew it, somewhere beneath the knowing, and buried that knowledge under the weight of the simplest lie available to him. She is better without this. He walked away. He married Evelyn Carter in 1951. Evelyn was intelligent and good-natured, and possessed a quality of relentless forward momentum that the decade required of its women. She loved Thomas with a practical devotion that he recognised and was grateful for and could not entirely meet. She sensed the locked room early. You cannot share a house with an absence that large and not eventually feel it displacing the air. But she was a woman of her era, trained in elegant endurance, and she managed it with a dignity that was its own form of heartbreak. One Christmas Eve she came downstairs for water and found him sitting in the dark beside the tree, a photograph held loosely in both hands. The lamp from the street caught it just enough. She did not need to see the face to understand whose it was. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went quietly back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and cried into a washcloth so he would not hear. She never mentioned it. This was either great love or great sorrow, and perhaps, in some marriages, in some eras, it was impossible to tell them apart. Savannah, Georgia. December 2013. Clara Bell Tucker was 92 years old, and she was looking for someone. She couldn't have explained it in language that made sense anymore. Language had become somewhat unreliable recently, the words slipping sideways when she reached for them, the names of things drifting just beyond her fingertips like something seen through gauze. But the feeling was precise. The feeling was as specific and insistent as weather. She was looking for warmth that had a heartbeat in it. She hugged the morning nurse, Eleanor, who had learned to simply stand still and allow it. She had tried once to gently redirect Clara toward her breakfast, and Clara had looked at her with such dignified bewilderment, but I'm not finished yet, that Elena had stopped redirecting and simply held still instead. She was a woman in her late 40s who had been through a divorce 2 years prior, the specific kind of divorce in which nothing dramatic happens, and yet everything essential is slowly revealed to have been hollow, and she had arrived at her work here with a clinical efficiency that was, she suspected, mostly armour. Clara's arms around her in the morning had begun to dismantle this armour in ways she didn't entirely want to examine. "Who are you looking for?" Eleanor asked one morning. Clara considered this with the careful deliberation she brought to everything these days. Her face turned slightly to one side as though listening to an interior translation. "The last place I felt safe," she said. Eleanor had been a nurse for 19 years. She did not cry easily or often. She went to the supply room after this and stood for a moment with a hand pressed against the metal shelf before she trusted herself to go back. The common room in December smelled like lavender soap and overheated air, and the ghost of institutional coffee and, faintly, the synthetic pine of the small Christmas tree the recreation coordinator had assembled near the television. Snow came down outside the tall windows in a way that softened the hard geometry of the parking lot. Clara liked to sit near those windows in the afternoons. She liked the way snow fell, without urgency, without drama, the way she imagined the very old must fall when they fell. On the 17th of December, at 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, a man was wheeled into the common room. He was thin in the way the very old are thin, not frail precisely but simplified, the body having shed everything non-essential across 9 decades until only the armature remained. His hair was white. His hands, resting on the arms of the wheelchair, were large and knuckled, and the creases of them were dark in a way that recalled some long-ago labour. His eyes were a tired blue, the blue of winter water, and they moved around the room with the cautious alertness of someone who has learned not to expect much from new places. Clara stopped breathing. She was not certain of anything cognitive. She was not standing in 1942. She was not 20 years old. She was not on a platform with snow in her hair. She was 92 in a common room with a lavender soap smell and a synthetic pine Christmas tree. She knew this, in the way that she knew things now, partially, incompletely, the way you know the words to a song you haven't heard in decades, and are surprised each time another one surfaces. But the recognition was not cognitive. It was physical. It moved through her the way his trembling had moved through her on the platform, from somewhere foundational, from somewhere the dementia had not reached, because the dementia worked on the surfaces of things, and this lived in a different place entirely. She sat for 30 seconds. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, and to the only person in the room, "You came back." Thomas Tucker turned his head toward her voice. He'd not heard her speak in 70 years. But a voice, like a face, has an architecture that lives below conscious recognition, and when her voice reached him across the room, it arrived somewhere in his chest before it arrived in his mind. His hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair. His mouth opened. He said nothing, because there was nothing sufficient, and he had learned long ago that insufficient words are worse than silence. His eyes filled, and he stopped fighting it, because he'd been many things in 70 years. A veteran, a husband, a widower, a resident of this place and that place, this decade and that one. He had been present at events and absent from them. He had been called good and well-meaning and steady and quiet. He had been loved, in various ways, by various people, as best as he deserved and occasionally better. But nobody had ever waited for him. Not like this. They put them near the window because Elena had quietly arranged it and nobody had questioned her. The reunion was not joyous. This was the thing that the staff had not expected. They had anticipated something cinematic, something that would give them a story to take home. But what they witnessed instead was devastation. A very quiet devastation, with no raised voices and no drama, only the quality of two people sitting together in the full understanding of what had been lost. You could see it in the way their hands lay on the table between them, not yet touching, as though touch required more acknowledgement of reality than either could yet manage. Thomas told her. He told her slowly, in the unspooled way of the very old and the very tired, about the artillery strike and the camps and the head wound and the letters that found nothing. He told her about standing on the sidewalk on Abercorn Street and watching someone else's children in her yard. He told her about Evelyn, gently, carefully, with the dignity Evelyn deserved, and about the decades of a marriage that had been, in its own way, real. Clara listened. Her face held the expression of someone listening to an account of a natural disaster, the earthquake that levelled the city while you were away, something that had happened to a version of your life rather than to you directly, and yet catastrophic precisely because of that. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you come find me again?" she asked. The question was simple. Its simplicity was the cruelest thing about it. Thomas looked at his hands, those large knuckled hands with their dark creases, still capable of tremendous gentleness, and no longer in any position to pretend the past 70 years had been something other than what they were. "I told myself you'd be better without what I'd come back as," he said. "And were you ever going to ask me?" she said. He had no answer. Shame is not an answer. Exhaustion is not an answer. The decades were not an answer. He met her eyes, which were still hazel, which were still, even across 92 years and the gauze of dementia, precisely as direct as they had always been when she chose to be direct, and he simply allowed her to see all of it. The cowardice and the sacrifice and the grief and the love, none of which had ever stopped operating simultaneously, all of it present and undefended. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She did not forgive him exactly. Forgiveness was too small a category for what 70 years required. What she did was something older and more fundamental. She simply recognized him as the man who had removed his gloves before taking her hands in cold weather, because he wanted her to feel skin rather than leather, as the man who had noticed her nervous habits before she had, as the man whose heartbeat she had memorized through 3 layers of wool on a platform in 1942, and never, she understood this now, with the clarity that dementia paradoxically provides by stripping everything else away, never once forgotten. "You came back," she said again, quietly, not quite to him, not quite to herself. His hand turned beneath hers and held on. They gave them the corner table by the courtyard window. This became official after approximately 4 days, because the staff discovered that attempting to seat either of them elsewhere produced a courteous but absolute resistance that was easier to respect than to argue with. The courtyard was small. 4 iron benches, a bird feeder Clara had asked for and received, a single rowan tree whose bare branches in December made a particularly fine drawing against the grey winter sky. They sat and watched the snow some mornings. They listened to the records Elena had found, a portable player and a small collection that included Glenn Miller and Billie Holiday and the Ink Spots. And when "I'll Be Seeing You" came through the small speaker one afternoon, Clara began crying before she fully understood that she was crying, the body releasing something that had been held under pressure for the better part of a century. Thomas put his arm around her. His arm was thin now. The muscles of it had been extraordinary once. She remembered that. The mechanic's arms, the capability of them. And what remained was the shape of what had been, the gesture still carrying the meaning even if the substance had simplified. She leaned into him. His shoulder was still warm. Everything else, the facility, the winter light, the synthetic pine Christmas tree, the 92 years, disappeared temporarily into the specific warmth of Thomas Tucker's shoulder, which was the same warmth it had always been, which had apparently been waiting in her nervous system all this time for something to compare it to again. They talked, in the unhurried way of the very old who have stopped performing for time. He told her about the garage in rural Georgia and the backfiring car on the 4th of July, and standing in the garage at midnight with engine parts, while his father stood beside him, saying engine won't fix itself. She told him about Helen. She told him about Helen at enormous length, which was right, because Helen deserved it. and about the roses that died every August in the kitchen window, and the 30 years of Saturday coffees, and the drawer with his letter in it that she had never thrown away. He closed his eyes when she said this. "That part about your hands," she said. "Been thinking about your hands lately. I read it every winter." He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Nathan came twice a week. Thomas's nephew was a careful, quietly emotional man in his late 50s who had spent years piecing together the family's buried history from storage boxes and returned letters and the elaborate silence of people who loved each other and could not say so, and who now sat with his uncle with the particular tenderness of someone who has finally understood the shape of a loss that predates his own existence. He brought good coffee. He was learning when to talk and when simply to be present, which is a form of love that most people require decades to acquire. Nathan had been in the attic for 2 hours before he found them. They were in a shoebox behind a broken lamp, a bundle of envelopes tied with kitchen string, the kind of string you use when you don't have ribbon, and it doesn't matter because nobody is meant to find it. He counted them without meaning to. 11. The return address on each one was the same. A street in Savannah, Georgia. The handwriting was a young woman's handwriting. Careful, slightly formal, the penmanship of someone who'd been taught that letters were occasions. None of them had been opened. He sat on the attic floor for a long time with the bundle in his hands. Dust settled around him. Outside, November moved through the bare trees. He sat until the cold came through the floorboards, and then he sat a little longer, because he needed to be certain of what he was holding before he brought it downstairs. He was certain. He brought them to Thomas. His uncle looked at the bundle for a long moment without touching it. Then he took it, held it in his lap the way you hold something that has been waiting a very long time to be held, carefully, with the full awareness that weight like this has accumulated interest. "Do you want me to?" Nathan began. "No," Thomas said. A silence. "They're still sealed," Nathan said quietly. Not an accusation, simply a fact that needed to exist in the air between them. "I know. You kept them for 60 years without... I know what they say." Thomas's voice was not defensive. It was exhausted in the way that only the very old and the very guilty can be exhausted, not tired of living, but tired of carrying. "I knew what they'd say the moment I saw her handwriting on the first one, and I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "If I read them, I would have had to go back, and I had already decided she deserved better than what came back from that war." Nathan said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. "I was wrong," Thomas said. Simply, completely. The two words Lolo carrying 60 years of weight, and nowhere left to set them down. As though he had been waiting for the right moment to say them, and had finally run out of reasons to wait. He asked Nathan to wheel him to the common room, to the window that looked out on the courtyard, where Clara would be sitting in her usual chair beside the bird feeder, watching the winter birds with the patient attention she gave to small things. He gave them to her himself. She took the bundle in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted, a slow interior movement, like light changing in a room when a cloud passes. She turned the envelopes over, touched the string, ran one finger along the edge of the topmost envelope with a delicacy that suggested her hands remembered something her mind was still reaching for. Her own handwriting, her own name in the return corner, her own careful, slightly formal penmanship, the hand of a young woman who had believed letters were occasions, staring back at her across 70 years, returned, returned, returned. She pressed the bundle against her chest with both hands and held it there. Her eyes closed. Thomas watched her and said nothing. Outside the courtyard window a sparrow landed on the bird feeder, and then another. and the bare rowan branches moved slightly in the December wind. After a long moment she opened her eyes. She looked at the bundle in her hands. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone performing an action they have decided upon completely, she worked the string loose. It fell away. She took the first envelope from the top of the stack and turned it in her hands, and then she did what Thomas had not been able to do for 60 years. She opened it. The paper inside was thin, the kind of paper people used when paper was rationed and you wrote small to make it last. She unfolded it with both hands, held it at the distance her eyes required now, and then her brow drew together, slowly, with a confusion that was not frustration, but something more tender than that. The bewilderment of someone reaching for a familiar thing and finding the shape of it changed. Her own handwriting had become foreign to her. She could see it was hers. She knew it was hers the way she knew Thomas's face, not through reasoning, but through something older than reasoning, something the dementia had not reached. But the words moved when she tried to hold them still. The letters rearranged themselves with the mild indifference of things that no longer felt obligated to cooperate. She looked up at Thomas. Without a word she held the letter out to him. He looked at it for a moment, at the thin paper and the small, careful handwriting and the 60 years of his own cowardice contained in a single unread page. Then he took it from her hands. He read it to himself first, just once, quickly, the way you assess something before you can trust yourself to speak it aloud. Then he began. His voice was rough at first, the voice of a 96-year-old man who had not read anyone's words aloud in a very long time, who had not been read to or read for someone else since before the war, who'd spent the better part of a century keeping language private and internal and carefully contained. But he read. Thomas, it has been 14 months. I planted the roses again this spring, though I'm not sure why, since I always kill them by August. Helen keeps telling me I should take a trip somewhere, and I keep telling her I can't think where I would go that would feel like anywhere worth being. I made too much coffee again this morning. I don't know why I keep doing that. I still sleep on my side of the bed. I thought you should know that I keep the porch light on after supper. Probably doesn't mean anything. I just thought you should know. Clara. He stopped. The common room was very quiet. The television murmured in the far corner. The sparrows moved on the bird feeder outside. Somewhere down the hallway a door opened and closed. Clara was looking at him, not with confusion, not with the travelling look she sometimes had, the one that moved between decades. She was looking at him with complete clarity, the hazel eyes direct and present and entirely themselves, as though the letter had recalled her from wherever the dementia had taken her and set her back down firmly in this chair, this room, this moment. I kept the light on, she said. I know, Thomas said. I know you did. Every night. I know. She looked at the remaining envelopes in her lap. 10 more. 10 more versions of the woman she'd been, reaching across silence, being sent back. She touched them lightly with her fingertips. Will you read them? She asked. All of them? Yes, Thomas said, without hesitation, without qualification. The answer he should have given 60 years ago arriving now, late and insufficient and the only thing left to offer. Every one. She settled back in her chair. Outside the window the December light was doing what December light does in the late afternoon, going golden and then going quickly, the way precious things do. Thomas took the next envelope, and in the failing winter light, with the sparrows moving on the feeder and the bare rowan branches tracing their fine lines against the pale sky, he read Clara's letters back to her. Her own young voice, returned at last from wherever it had been held all those years, finally arriving where it had always been trying to go. She listened with her eyes closed and her hands open in her lap, as though she were receiving something, as though, After 70 years of being sent back, she had finally been delivered. It came on a night when the snow was falling seriously, the way it rarely does in Savannah. Not the apologetic dusting of their courtship, but something committed, something that meant it. The courtyard had disappeared beneath 4 inches. The rowan tree wore white along every branch. Clara had wandered from her room at 9:30. Eleanor found her sitting near the window at the end of the hall in the dark, her hands pressed together in her lap, her face turned to the courtyard glass with an expression of absolute listening. "Mrs. Tucker," Eleanor said softly. Clara's eyes moved slowly toward her, and then somewhere past her, into a middle distance that Elena had learned was not confusion exactly, but a different geography, the place Clara went when the present and the past became the same country. "He's going to get on the train," Clara said. Eleanor sat down beside her. She didn't correct her. She'd learned months ago that correcting Clara's time was not kindness. It was simply bureaucratic insistence on a calendar that Clara's inner life had no reason to obey. Thomas appeared in the hallway a few minutes later in his robe, moving his wheelchair with the slow, deliberate effort of a man who will not be deterred. Nathan had told him Clara sometimes walked at night when she was frightened, and Thomas had apparently decided at 96 years old, at nearly 10 o'clock in the evening, that this was information he needed to act on. He positioned his wheelchair beside her chair. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. The same travelling look, past and present, 1942 and 2013, the train station and the window, and then something simplified in her expression, something resolved, the way a complicated piece of music resolves to its home chord. "I thought you were leaving," she said. "I know. I couldn't find." She stopped. Her hands pressed harder together. "I couldn't find the feeling anymore." He understood her. He had always understood her in the particular language she used when she was frightened. Not the words, but the thing underneath them. "Do you still remember?" he asked. Her eyes found his directly. Hazel. Direct. Still. She nodded. Thomas reached up with both arms, slowly, with the effort it cost him, his 96-year-old body cataloguing its objections and then setting them aside, and he opened them. Clara looked at him. At this man who was made of 70 lost years and 1 kept promise, and the specific blue of winter water in his eyes. She looked at him the way you look at something you've been holding in memory for so long that the reality of it is both stranger and more true than any image could be. She closed her eyes, and he held her. His arms around her were thin and trembling, not from fear this time, not from the terror of leaving, but from age and cold and the accumulated weight of all the years they had managed to live through separately and somehow arrive, both of them, at this window, on this night. But the warmth was there, beneath everything, unchanged by anything. The warmth was there. His heart beat against her cheek through the thin fabric of his robe. She felt it. Her nervous system recognized it before her mind did. The specific pressure, the specific warmth, the specific sound of Thomas Casey Tucker's heart still working in his chest, and something in her that had been holding for 70 years, with the rigid faithfulness of a structure that cannot afford to shift, finally, quietly, released. "Open your eyes, Clara," he whispered. She did. His face, older than time and entirely familiar, an inch from hers. "I'm still here," he said. "Not I'm finally here. Not I'm sorry I was gone so long. Not any of the things that might have been true and useful and insufficient. I'm still here." Because that was what he had said to her on the platform. "Remember, I'm still here." And she had remembered. She had remembered for 70 years, which was, it occurred to her now, with the lucid simplicity that dementia sometimes provides at its own inscrutable intervals, not a tragedy of loyalty, but its proof. She had not been frozen. She had been faithful to something real, to something that turned out, against all probability and grief and the bureaucratic determination of governments, to be true. She pressed her face against his chest. Outside, the snow continued its committed falling. Eleanor stood at the end of the hall and watched. After a moment, she pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, and then walked, with professional composure, to the supply room, where she stood in the dark for the third time in her career at this facility, and allowed herself to feel what she was feeling without trying to name it or contain it. One morning in February, the nurses found Clara asleep in her chair beside Thomas's bed. She had moved there sometime in the night, in the way she sometimes moved without fully waking, her body navigating by an older map than consciousness provided. Her head was tilted toward him. Their hands were joined across the space between chair and bed, his large knuckled hand and her small one, the fingers loosely intertwined with the uncomplicated intimacy of people who have stopped requiring reasons for things. Thomas was awake. He was watching the window, where the courtyard rowan tree made its fine drawing against a pale sky, the kind of sky that precedes clearing. He watched the snow on the rowan branches, and he was quiet in the way he had been quiet his whole life. The stillness that people who didn't know him had always mistaken for reserve, and Clara had always known, was simply attention, his complete attention, offered without performance. She stirred slightly. Her hand tightened in his. He did not move. He didn't wake her. He simply held her hand in the careful, specific way he had always held things that required care. The moths on window panes, her chin, all the various fragile instruments of the world. And he watched the rowan tree and the changing sky, and the light beginning its slow work across the courtyard. He had told her, on the platform in 1942, "Close your eyes and remember this moment if I don't come home." He had said it because he was terrified of becoming only memory, of being reduced to absence, of being loved and then, slowly, by the ordinary mercy of time, let go. He had not understood in 1942 what Clara would teach him across 70 years without ever meaning to. That memory, faithfully kept, is not a substitute for love. It is love, in its most stubborn, most undefended form. Love that continues operating in the dark, without audience, without reward, without any reasonable expectation of return. She had kept him. Not the photograph, not the ritual, not the letter in the kitchen drawer, though all of those too. She had kept him, the feeling of him, his warmth, his heartbeat, the specific pressure of his arms around her, which her body had refused to relinquish for 9 decades, as though it understood, beneath all the mechanisms of cognition and grief, that he was still out there somewhere and still real and still hers. And here he was, still here. Outside, a single bird landed on the feeder in the courtyard. Thomas watched it. Clara slept beside him with her hand in his. The snow on the rowan branches began, almost imperceptibly, to melt. For everyone who kept the light on,